Italian General Luigi Cadorna, his 12 Battles of Isonzo, and the Italian performance in the Great War have become a bit of a meme in history circles. For some reason, people like to look at the past and think, wow, these people were really stupid, rather than considering the possibility that these people did what they could with what they had. The discourse around World War I is especially bad in this regard, with a strong lions led by sheep myth. And I find that the Italian Chief of Staff, Luigi Cadorna, gets the worst of it. In my opinion, unfairly. So here is why Luigi Cadorna wasn't as bad as you thought. But before we get to it, please subscribe and leave a like. Enjoy! On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on the Central Powers. For the next 3.5 years, Italian armies bitterly fought the overstretched Austrian armies in the Alpine front, fought 12 battles of the Isonzo River, lost 1.5 million of its people, yet did not achieve a single meaningful victory. In late 1917, the Italian front almost shattered in the Austro-German offensive in Capoetto. All this, especially the 12 failed battles of the Isonzo River, looks terrible on paper. After all, who would try the same failed offensive over and over again and expect different results? Well, let me tell you. Someone who has no other course. What is never discussed is the impossible Italian geography during World War I. This is the terrain map of Italy. It is surrounded by the Mediterranean on 3 sides and the Alps to the north. Although this makes Italy highly defensible, it also works as a double-edged sword and makes any offensives out of Italy almost impossible, especially in the context of World War I, when defense was king. But let's get closer. This is the Austro-Italian border in 1914. The wider northern flank is completely covered by the Alps for hundreds of kilometers. Meanwhile, in the small eastern strip, there is a very narrow 20-kilometer gap that lies between Gorizia and Monfalcone and leads to the Slovenian plains. In this area, it is still hilly, but not as hellish as the rest of the border. This gap is the only way in and out of Italy. This is the Isonzo River Valley, and this is where the 12 battles of the Isonzo took place. They didn't happen because Luigi Cadorna and the Italians were stupid. They happened because it was the only place where the Italians could attack. And the Italian offensives went as good as one could expect. Unsurprisingly, a 20-kilometer strip defended by hundreds of thousands of Austrian troops proved impossible to breach. In this way, the Italians were no more or less successful than the British and French armies at Gallipoli and Macedonia. Just for the sake of it, let's analyze the other strategic alternatives the Italian High Command could have pursued. I was able to come up with 2 possible and 1 really stupid suggestion. Let's start with the very stupid one. The Albanian and Adriatic fronts, which would include establishing a stronger base in Albania, merging with the Serbians, and applying pressure to the Austrians from an arguably better position. The reason this is extremely stupid is the non-existent Albanian infrastructure and Italian logistical capabilities at the time, or rather the lack of it. Italy simply could not have transported and supplied a full army across the Adriatic. With that out of the way, there are 2 more sensible alternatives. 1. Doing nothing. This no doubt would have saved many Italian lives. However, such an action would be unpalatable to the Italian nationalists and Italy's Entente allies. More than likely, the British and the French would leverage their war subsidies and force the Italians to commit to the war. The second alternative would be sending the Italian troops to help the war efforts in other Allied fronts, namely the Western Front and the Macedonian Front. This may make more sense militarily speaking than the Isonzo offensives. However, hundreds of thousands of Italian casualties in faraway lands would be an impossible sell to the Italian public, and the political pressure would have made this option impossible to pursue. Overall, the Italian High Command had the right idea. Italy at the time had a very limited industrial base, but a sizable manpower pool. Propped by the British and French economic aid, it was always going to win a war of attrition. So that's what it fought. Italian High Command threw Italian soldiers into the meat grinder, dragging the thinly stretched Austrians with them. And it worked. Many Italians died in the battles of the Isonzo, but by 1917, the Austrians were completely exhausted and on the verge of collapse. This is why, after the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, the Germans had to intervene. Roughly 100,000 German troops using modern stormtrooper tactics joined the Austrians in the Battle of Capoetto, and only then the Italians were defeated. Now, the Italians had their operational problems, there is no denying that. But even in Capoetto, it is important to remember that the Italian position was not as defensible as the Austrian one. While Austrians had almost 100 miles of mountains to fall back on in most sectors, Italians were only a couple of miles away from the plains of the Po River Valley. Any tactical breakthrough by the Germans could swiftly end with Italians being pushed into a vulnerable position in the plains. The other major factor that needs to be considered in Capoetto specifically was the superiority of the German tactics. Germans at this point had the most capable army at a tactical and an operational level, and the Italian army was a second-tier power. Italians lacked the tactical expertise, command structures, and the industrial base to bring its army even to the standards of 1914, let alone 1917. With or without Cadorna, the Italians were never going to stop the German breakthrough in Capoetto. As for the final verdicts on Cadorna, militarily speaking, he was one of the better officers that Italy could offer. He managed his front as well as any other commander at the time could have managed. It was Cadorna's logistical efforts that had made the Italian army capable of fighting a modern war. When the war began, Italian troops had no machine guns, grenades, very little rifle and artillery ammunition, and big guns. Within a few months, Italian army was as well equipped as the Italian war production would allow it to be. Overall, Cadorna's successes in the Italian mobilization efforts are usually understated, and I think it's also noteworthy that he was held in high regard by his French and British contemporaries. All that being said, despite all the excuses I've made for Cadorna, he had one shortcoming that still made him a bad general. This shortcoming was not with his military skills, but his people skills. Cadorna was disliked by his officers and soldiers. He was a strict disciplinarian and severely punished any infraction. Many officers were executed without proper court-martials. He also neglected the living conditions of the Italian soldiers, which resulted in the Italian front nearly collapsing in a mutiny in 1917. But at the end of the day, he wasn't stupid, and his strategies made more sense than many people might realize today. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.